Can you hear me all right with the microphone? Yes? Okay. Okay, good. So welcome to the First Religious Society Unitarian Universalist in Newburyport, Massachusetts. That's what I need to know. I thank you. How's this? Okay? All right. Welcome to First Religious Society, Unitarian Universalist in Newburyport, Massachusetts. My name is Stephen Wolf Foster, and I am delighted to be your worship associate today. If you're joining us for the first time, hello, Michael, welcome. And if you're, and we are glad you're here. We come together at FRS online and in person, committed to love and to peace and to justice. Our mission and our invitation to us all is to come as we are, the journey together in love, to act with courage, and to transform the world. If you're worshiping online and would like to access this morning's order of service, please click on the link just below the live stream. If you'd like a large print order of service, well, we don't have large print order of service today, so I apologize for that. When summer's over, we'll be operating full steam ahead. But if you need an order of service or a hymnal, just ask an usher, and they'll be glad to provide it for you. Today we have Reverend Jane at our pulpit, and she will be introducing many of us. Some of us might already know about Margaret Fuller, but she'll be introducing Margaret Fuller to us from way back in the mid-1800s. A very powerful woman. We are very glad to be here. We are glad you were here. And I thank you. Here's a quote from Margaret Fuller. "Inward and outward freedom for woman, as much as for man, shall be acknowledged as a right, not as a concession. As the friend of the Negro assumes that one man cannot hold another in bondage, so should the friend of a woman assume that a man cannot, by right, lay even well-meant restrictions on women." And that was Margaret Fuller in 1844.
Thank you, Stephen, and good morning. Welcome. Thank you very much for being here on this beautiful, beautiful Sunday, because it's so lovely. And I think it's the first really cool Sunday. You get triple points for being here today. Really commendable. As Stephen said, well, first of all, we're going to ask you, before you get too comfortable, to come forward. There aren't that many of us here today, and it creates an opportunity, I think, for us to be a little bit more together, and we're going to do something a little bit different in this service. And this way, I can invite you into our experiment a little bit more fully. So you guys are fine, because you're sat up front anyway. But everybody behind Karen and Stephanie, maybe just come forward a little bit. Carol, you're okay, you and Art, but everybody else, that's great. Thank you. Thanks for humoring me. Today we're going to be speaking about a time in the mid-19th century when our American Republic was still new, and the promise of America was fresh, even in the face of some stark contradictions. The promises of our founding documents existed at the same time as the contradictions of slavery, displacement of Native people, and gender inequity. But this was a time of hope, a time of promise, and this was an historic time. The Transcendentalists were bringing a new liberal religion to Puritan New England, and Margaret Fuller was calling for a second American Revolution. Today, in 2024, we find ourselves also in historic times. Important rights for women have been lost and are under assault, and democracy itself and the rule of law are challenged. John Buren, who was the president of the UUA, the Unitarian Universalist Association, for 10 years, stood here in this sanctuary 4 years ago. And at that point in time, he said, "We are the spiritual descendants of the Transcendentalists. For better or for worse, these are our times. We are called to defend our UU principles. We are called to defend democracy. We are called to action. You are faithfully called to worship."
Good morning. Let us rise in body or in spirit and join our voices in singing hymn number 391 in the gray hymnal, Voice Still and Small. Please be seated.
And now, as Ray lights our chalice, please join us in saying our chalice lighting words. Words can be found in the order of service. We gather this hour as people of faith, with joys and sorrows, ifs and needs. We light this beacon of hope, sign of our quest for truth and meaning, in celebration of the life we shared together. Please rise, in body and in spirit, as you are able. We join our voices in the affirmation of faith. The words can also be found in your order of service. Love is the doctrine of our church. The quest of truth is our sacrament, and service is our prayer. To dwell together in peace, to seek knowledge in freedom, to serve all creation in fellowship, to the end that all souls shall grow into harmony with the divine. Thus do we covenant with each other and with God.
From all that dwell below the skies, let faith and hope with love arise. Let beauty, truth, and good be sung through every land, by every tongue.
Please be seated. The generosity of our community is an essential ministry that supports the work of the church, both in Newburyport and beyond. Each week, 50% of the Sunday offering not designated as a pledge goes to a local community partner engaged in important efforts to transform our region. The July shared collection goes to support Community Action, Inc., which provides resources and opportunities for individuals, families, and communities to overcome poverty. CAI envisions strong, thriving communities free of poverty, building hope and offering assistance on respect and understanding. CAI's Head Start program is for preschool children ages 0 to 5 from low-income families. To give online, please use the link in the order of service or below the live stream. You can also make a contribution by text, and of course, you can always mail a check to the church. Thank you. The offering will now be gratefully received.
Thank you, Gina. Now it is time for our community prayers of joys and sorrows. And Stephen will be lighting candles as I share these with you. You can always send joy or sorrow to betweenus@frssuu.org. We'll write one in the book, and we'll be happy to include them. Today we light a candle of care and concern for Barbara Owen. Barbara fell last Wednesday while packing books to bring to the FRS book sale, and she has fractured her hip. She was operated on last Wednesday. The operation was successful. She was recovering at Anna Jake's until yesterday. When she moved yesterday, she was moved to Port Health Center, and I was with her as she was transferred, and she said, "Please tell everyone how much I appreciate their prayers and concerns and love." She said, "My family, biological family, is far away in California, but she said, I'm so surrounded with my FRS loving family," and she is. She has an extraordinary care team taking care of her. Our second candle is also a candle of sorrow and care, and this is for Liz Larson, who is a member who participates virtually. She actually lives in New York. Her father passed this Wednesday. Liz was with him throughout his final passage. And she said also to tell you that while physically distant, she has very much felt the prayers, the positive thoughts, and the love from this congregation. and it felt very strong sense of belonging, even though she is physically distant. And she said, please keep the prayers coming and the good thoughts and meditations for her and her brother as they move through the next days and months to come. We light a happy candle, a candle of joy and gratitude with Jean Noonan, who is celebrating the birth of a new grandson, Charles Xavier Noonan, who was born on Thursday, and whose name honors his two abuelos, his grandfathers, Charles Noonan and also Carlos Xavier Gonzalez. They express gratitude for the nurses and the staff of OBGYN unit at Beth Israel. Baby Charlie is doing fine, and our daughter-in-law Carla is recovering. We ask for prayers for continued healing for our daughter-in-law Carla, as there were unexpected and some frightening complications during this planned C-section, which made for a very stressful time. And finally, Heidi and Holly Gowan ask that we express their thanks for all the prayers and good wishes and positive energy sent to them, because their cat, Lakota, was in the hospital for 19 days, but has come home and is recovering nicely. So that they wish to express their gratitude. And finally, as we always do, we light one final candle for all the joys and sorrows, though unspoken, which remain deeply held and cared about in our hearts. Let us take a moment or two of silence as we offer prayers and positive thoughts in response to these requests for prayers. Thank you. They both thank you. Today we're going to try something a little bit different. And those of you who have been coming to the July services realize we've been using these services to experiment a little bit, letting go of some of the elements that are traditionally in our service, and sometimes just mixing things up to try out some new formats. See how use this as an opportunity to do so. So we're going to do that today. And rather than deliver a sermon for 17 to 20 minutes, Stephen and I are going to have a dialogue. And we're going to have a dialogue about Margaret Fuller. And I hope that you find it somewhat enlightening and might pique your interest. And if there's time, we could even maybe open it up, which would be truly wonderful. So here we go.
So the chairs only work if you can see us, and we'll have the mic in hand. I'm reminding myself. Uh-oh. Yes. Hi.
Hi.
Margaret Fuller, huh?
Yeah, Margaret Fuller. Why? Who is she and why?
Yes. Who is she?
Okay. Thank you. Yeah, so the questions were, who is Margaret Fuller and why are we talking about her today? And I guess there are two answers I would share with you. First is, to be truthful and candid, my niece, Scriptunis, is about to start on a novel about the life of Margaret Fuller. So that sort of piqued my interest. And as I learned more about her, I reflected on the fact that growing up, as probably many of you in high school, we heard about the Transcendentalists and Thoreau and Emerson and Walden Pond. I never heard anything about any women Transcendentalists, nothing, until a few years ago when I read the Peabody Sisters. And that was really the first time that I encountered Margaret Fuller. And I started to realize that this is not just about my very partial and incomplete telling of Unitarian history and the history of the Transcendentalists, but Margaret Fuller was an absolutely pivotal and critical person in the history of American women's rights and a much broader history. And so I wanted to talk about that, and that brings me to my second reason, which is because in 2024, I feel fear and anxiety a lot when I think about our country and the state of democracy. And I don't want to go into a place, I know that if I'm not mindful, when I get afraid and when I get anxious, either I shut down, I think I'm not going to watch any more news or read any more newspaper, I get overwhelmed, and sometimes I isolate. And I don't want to do any of those things. And I sure as heck don't want to get paralyzed, which is the other thing that happens to me. So I thought if I talked about this, it will start to help me share my fears and concerns, talk to you all because I know we share a lot of the same principles and commitments. And I'm looking to our history for some courage here. You know, we have a tremendous history of Unitarians fighting for freedom and liberty, and sometimes against overwhelming odds. So given the state that I'm in, I'm sort of making this declaration that when I feel afraid and anxious, I'm going to reach out and share my fears, but talk with you all because I think there's some lessons that we can be learning here.
Yes, it's a great idea. I, way back when in the 70s, went to college and chose philosophy as my discipline that I wanted to get my degree in, my bachelor's degree, and loved studying transcendentalism. Not a peep about Margaret Fuller. So I was very, very happy to see this now at this stage of my life. And
Good.
Look forward to learning more.
Thanks,
you.
Stephen. So just some facts about Margaret Fuller. She was born the oldest of 8 children in 1810 in what was then called Cambridgeport. It's now part of Cambridge. It's actually, her home is where the Microsoft headquarters building is, or was. And at any rate, she was born the oldest of 8 to Timothy Fuller, and her mother was Margaret Crane Fuller. Timothy Fuller was a, quote, Harvard High Scholar, a graduate of high studies at Harvard College, which meant that he was steeped in the classics, in Roman and Greek history, and he was disappointed that his firstborn child was not a son. But he decided to educate her anyway, as if she were a boy. So that became one of the most significant factors in her life. She was a prodigy. By the age of 3, it was obvious to both of her parents that she was an exceptionally intelligent person. And being educated as a boy, her father was a very strict and very critical teacher. So her life was structured, would be an understatement. When she was 3 years old, her father was then serving in the United States Congress, and he wrote to his mother and said, "Tell Margaret that I love her if she learns to read, and she's a good girl." So by the age of 3 and a half, Margaret was reading in English, and by the age of 5, she was reading in English, Latin, and Greek, and by the age of 8, she was reading Virgil in Latin. So let's be careful what expectations we put on our children and grandchildren, really. In her early life, she really lived in 2 worlds. In the daytime, she was helping her mother. Her mother had 6 kids. You know, one of them died. She had 6 kids. She was the oldest. So her days were so taken up with housework, taking care of these children with her mother, trying to tutor her brothers who were expected to be ready to go to Harvard College, which was not open to her. And then at night, when her father would come home, they would begin her lessons, and she would often start at 9 o'clock at night and go to as late as 1:30, which was a young girl at that point in time. But she was so driven, and she had so much capacity. But it was a kind of bifurcated world. And she did not fit, you know, she did not have a lot of friends as a girl because she was odd. You know, she was so bright, she spoke all these languages, and she was educated as a boy. So she did not fit in the modes of the time and the models for girls and women at that time.
Yeah, indeed.
Yeah.
I can see, though, that with my psychology background, I can see how the upbringing and the times just kind of encouraged her to focus on, well, I guess I'm going to have to find my own way if I'm got this intelligence and I'm interested and curious.
Yeah,
and how that would lead her to find a transcendentalism as
yeah.
a guiding light for a while.
And growing up, she was also, is I think significant that she was plain and brilliant. And I emphasize this because there was a new book that came out about her in mid-March last year. And the opening sentence in the flap is the beautiful and brilliant Margaret Fuller. Well, she wasn't beautiful. Her Pulitzer Prize-winning biographer, Megan Marshall, said, nobody called Margaret beautiful. She had severe stenosis. She was quite stooped. She was nearsighted, so she was squinting often. And she herself wrote about wishing that she had been beautiful because she saw herself as surrounded by beautiful women. But it's the combination of plain and brilliant that was making her outlook look a little bit dim, because for most women in those times, the only way out of their father's house was to get married. And the feminine ideal at that time was women who were, quote, pale, frail, and ethereal. And Margaret wasn't any of those things, nothing. So it was important. She also had some disappointments in romance early on. Before she was in her early 20s, she had been rejected twice by possible suitors. And so she was looking forward and thinking, what choices are there for me? What paths are open for me? Really.
So she had to grow, and she had her interests, and she learned some things, and she became, over time, she grew to become she used her prodigious knowledge, her prodigy mind, to help her really get into what we now call feminism, and to really focus on women's issues, and to really focus on what culture does to women.
Right, that's true. And she reinvented herself many times. She was an educator, she was an editor, she was a journalist. She became the author of some extremely important seminal works, and she was our first national overseas foreign correspondent. All those breaking glass. But she had it was a long path to go from where she was to finding those avenues for herself. And I think it's kind of interesting to look at this because, as I said before, I looked to her for courage. There were so many times where the doors were slammed in her face, and yet, she found it within herself to keep going. And one of those was, first she became a teacher. When she was 20, her father died, and he died without a will. So his estate was divided between two brothers, parsimonious, controlling brothers. So she had no money, and she realized she had to leave home, which was then Groton, to go out and make her way in the world. And because she not only had to support herself, but she felt she needed to support her mother and her siblings as well. So she was able to get a job with Bronson Alcott, who was Louisa May Alcott's father, and he had started this experimental school in Boston. And it was radical. It was such a radical experiment because they were educating girls with boys. These were co-ed classrooms. I think they were the only ones in New England, certainly in Boston. And they admitted black and brown children as well. So this was radical on those fronts, and their method of education was out of step with the norm. The norm was rote memory. And they had begun to explore these ideas, the transcendentalist ideas about discovery and self-reliance and self-expression and development. And so they had a completely different approach. They believed that children have innate knowledge, and their jobs as teachers was not to pour knowledge into these empty vessels, but to teach them to discover their own truths and to express them verbally and in writing. So that was a wonderful experience for her, except for the fact that she was promised a salary, which never came. So for 2 years, she had no income while teaching full-time at this school and was living in poverty in one room in a boarding house in Boston.
Now, had she met Emerson at this time or before this time?
Yeah, so she was introduced, Elizabeth Peabody was a extremely important mentor, and the only woman that I think was sort of a role model for Margaret Fuller, because she was 6 years older, and she had taught school, and she faced poverty too, and had to support herself. So Elizabeth Peabody had arranged an introduction to Emerson, and both Emerson and Elizabeth Peabody suggested that she take this job. But then, about the same time, in 1839, Emerson realized the Transcendentalists were becoming so prolific in their work and their outpouring, they needed a journal. So he said, let's start the Dial, which was a philosophical, cultural, literary journal of the Transcendentalists, and asked Margaret Fuller to be the first editor, which was, in many ways, the break she needed. You know, finally she had a venue to express herself. She was bringing in all these Transcendentalist authors, poets, and it was a wonderful time, except, again, that Emerson had promised her a salary when the Dial became financially self-sufficient, which never happened. So once again, Margaret is working incredible hours getting this increasingly influential journal out, no pay. So she started to, driven by poverty, and I think loneliness in some ways, she started her conversations, which are really classes for women. And there were no, this is so hard for us to understand in our day, but there were no venues for women to develop intellectually at that point in time. I mean, the idea of a woman's education was teaching them needlepoint and piano and the decorative arts, but nothing that was really developing them intellectually or conveying the idea that they had ideas worth developing and expressing. So she started the conversations, and they ran from 1839 to 1844. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that was tremendously important. Fuller, because Peabody helped her recruit 14 women. The women who came over time to be in her classes included Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Lucretia Mott, Sophia Ripley, virtually all of the women who convened the first National Women's Rights Convention had been students of Margaret Fuller. And she started with always two questions. Who are we as women, and what is ours to do? Now, I have to think that for those women, even though most of them were women of privilege, those were radical questions. Probably nobody had ever asked, because it was just assumed that marriage and motherhood were the past. So those questions were pretty radical for opening. She started with the classics, but then, as she had at Alcott School, she taught them to think for themselves. You know, she taught them that she was not going to be lecturing them, but they needed to reflect on what they were learning and express themselves verbally, express themselves in writing. They learned to critique each other, to debate with one another. And I think that was so important because ultimately, not only did Fuller write the founding documents of the American Women's Equal Rights Movement, but those women who were her students, they were the wave. They were the ones who convened the National Convention. They were the ones who powered up the movement for women's suffrage. So her influence on them was remarkable.
Living in times when things were difficult for women, but also her wider view of difficulties and oppression in the United States at the time and elsewhere, you know, and yet she stayed with it. She wanted to find solutions, and she knew that to find solutions, she needed to have women join her to find solutions.
And men allies as well.
Yeah.
So she and Emerson had through all of these years a very intense, complicated relationship, full of tensions. And for a long time, he was probably her most important mentor and supporter, along with Elizabeth Peabody. But at some point in time, she went beyond him, I think. They were I was talking to Harold Babcock about this, and he said, these male transcendentalists were enlightened men, and they were men of their times.
Yeah.
So they were not used to dealing with a woman as an equal, as a peer, and she started to push on women's rights, and suddenly she hit some of those limits. So even when she started to write about marriage and how she thought marriage was an oppressive institution for everybody, but particularly for women, boom, she hit those limits of her times. And even Emerson at first said, this is too radical, this would be upturning our entire society to seek equal rights for women in marriage. So she hit that limit. And then something else happened, which to me shows how she took hardship and made it a crucible. So what happened then was she had introduced some of these bright young students in her classes to Emerson, to the great sage of Concord. And two of them were Samuel Ward Gray and Anna Barker. Margaret Fuller loved Samuel Ward Gray, and she loved Anna Barker. And she brought them to meet Emerson and introduced them to the great man, and they fell in love and got engaged. And that broke Margaret Fuller's heart. And then they invited Emerson, so they did not invite Margaret to the wedding, and they invited Emerson to be the guest of honor, the esteemed guest of honor at their wedding. And I think it was that plus the no paycheck from the dial, plus no paycheck from teaching that drove her out of Concord. And that was the best thing that ever happened, because that world, while they were breaking new ground, they were radical, but it was still a pretty insular, self-referential triangle. They went from Concord to Cambridge to Boston, from lecture hall to UU Church to classrooms, but they were not out in a larger world. So she took off. It took a lot of courage. She was leaving everything that she knew, all her friends, everything, but she took off and she went west. And first she went to Chicago by train, and then she kept going, and she traveled by stagecoach, and then she kept going, and she went west and northwest out into the unrolling American prairies and plains, and then she went by canoe, and she kept going. And she ended up spending time with Native Americans. She saw the magnificence of this country, the expansiveness of the wilderness, and she was so in awe of it. And she was in awe of the Native Americans. And at the time, the prevalent philosophy of some of our political leaders was manifest destiny, which basically was a rationalization of white supremacy. It said, somehow, you European Americans have been given dominion. You have dominion over the entire continent. Expand your dominion. Expand and proselytize Christianity and capitalism. And, I'm being slightly sardonic, but not a lot. I mean, it really was a rationalization for white supremacy when you think about it. And Margaret Fuller, because she spent time with Native Americans, saw the beauty and the dignity of their way. And she called it genocide. She saw what was happening, treaty after treaty being broken, people being dislodged, sometimes even forced to clear what had been their own land to make room for the homesteaders, who were white families being subsidized by the government, to come out and settle. And it broke her heart. And she called it out. And here again, she was a lone voice, as far as I know. At that time, most people were not calling out the underlying false premises behind the manifest destiny. If you think about how much harm has been done in the name of that document. So that trip was enormously expansive for her. And I say this because her compassion was growing. Her intellect was already so highly developed. She was so erudite and had so many skills, but this was growing her heart. She was now really taking in and relating as an equal. She was down on her knees making corn with Native American women. She went to a gathering of the Ojibwe Nation and spent time there. So she came to have great respect for them. She called them America's first families. So that grew her heart and her compassion, which I think fueled her writing and her scope. The one other thing I would mention, and before she went to New York, so she had come to the attention of Horace Greeley, who was the editor of the New York Tribune, which is one of the 3 biggest papers in the country. And she came to his attention. She had a letter from Emerson, but more importantly, his wife, Mary, had been taking the train from New York to Boston to attend her classes. So he already knew who Margaret Fuller was. And he offered her the position of becoming the literary and cultural editor of the New York Tribune. Another first. There was nobody, so she'd been the first woman to gain access to Harvard Library. She was the first woman to be an editor of a major literary, cultural, philosophical journal, and now the first woman to become a front page policy writer for a major urban newspaper.
Strikes me as a real pioneer, just being very true to her own values and just using her voice to help other people discover what their values are.
Yeah.
And help other people use their voice too. In a difficult world, which is sort of our predicament.
Right. So an aspect of her, what is her contribution, ultimately? I think for me, it is twofold. One is her work in laying out the case, a systemic analysis of gender bias. So she, as the editor of The Dial, she wrote an essay called The Great Lawsuit, Man versus Mankind, Women versus Womankind. And in that essay, she wrote out this detailed, brilliant analysis of the underlying false assumptions that were used to rationalize the suppression of women and the restriction of women and the denial of women. She laid it out in The Great Lawsuit. Megan Marshall, who won the Pulitzer Prize for the Peabody Sisters, and for her biography of Margaret Marshall, said that The Great Lawsuit was, in her opinion, the most important contribution of the transcendentalists to American thought. So it was a tremendously important document because it hadn't been done, And I think about today, our theme for the next church year is truth. And I think about how did Margaret Fuller do this, right? Women didn't even vote in those days. How did she go about changing this concept of women being inferior and the treatment of Native Americans in society in which those were so embedded? And I think she went back to her truth. She went back to the truth. She used the transcendentalist ideas of self-reliance and that every person has a right and a duty to develop themselves. And I think her 2 real critical insights were, one was she wrote that African Americans, Negroes, have souls, and women have souls. And so it is not possible for man to develop if he is holding another person in bondage. And it is not possible for man to develop spiritually if he is laying restrictions on the rights of any women. So she called out this fundamental truth, right? And she called out, in calling out Manifest Destiny, the truth again, that we are born equal, the transcendentalist truth that we all have a spark of the divine within us. Therefore, we are all sisters and brothers and children of God. And when you lay those kinds of fundamental truths out, the falsities of Manifest Destiny and the claim of the differences of women, that we don't have the biological equipment to go to college, they all just fall away in the face of those truths. So I say that because, I know I'm talking a lot, but as I think about the fall, and even now I get times where I feel really afraid. I'm sure many of you have the debate I have every single evening of how much news to watch, right? Or how many papers to read. Because I don't want to feel that fear and I don't want to feel anxious. But I think if I keep talking about it and invite my brothers and sisters to come together in the fall and focus on our central truths. Some of the liberties which the transcendentalists articulated, we are now defending. We are now defending rights that I didn't think as an American I would ever have to defend. We are defending. But we have our principles, and we have our voices, and we have our beloved community. So if we do it together, then I think I won't be so afraid, because I trust this community to come together and do the right thing.
Amen.
And so be it, I hope.
So be it.
Okay.
Thank you, Reverend Jane.
Thank you, Stephen.
Yeah.
Ray, are you going to take us home?
Take us home.
Let us now rise in body or in spirit and join our voices in hymn number 170, We Are a Gentle, Angry People. All 6 verses. We are a gentle, angry people, and we are singing for our lives. We are a gentle, angry people, and we are singing for our lives. We are a justice-seeking people, and we are singing for our lives. We are a justice-seeking people, and we are singing for our lives. We are young and old together, and we are singing for our lives. We are young and old together, and we are singing for our lives. We are a land of many colors, and we are singing for our lives. We are a land of many colors, and we are singing for our lives. We are getting straight together, and we are singing for our lives. We are getting straight together, and we are singing for our lives. We are a gentle, loving people, and we are singing for our lives. We are a gentle, loving people, and we are singing for our lives.
You may be seated.
Oh, right here.
May the love which overcomes all differences, which heals all wounds, which puts to flight all fears, which reconciles all who are separated, be in us and among us, now and always.
Thank you. Margaret Mead said, "Never doubt that a handful of committed individuals can change the world. Indeed, it is the only thing that ever has." So let us go forth now, calm in the knowledge that we are facing, as our ancestors did, times that try the souls and the characters of Americans. We stand on the shoulders of Unitarian transcendentalists, foremothers and forefathers, who did change the culture, who did open up doors for equity, justice, self-determination, self-expression, spiritual and religious freedom. This is our heritage. We are called to preserve these liberties today. Let us go forward confident in our determination to stand for our UU principles in solidarity with one another and with those less privileged. And we do so in the name of our beloved country and our beloved community. May it be so. Go now and return again in great joy.
Amen.
Amen.